Today, we're diving into a topic that, well, it's puzzled thinkers for millennia. Paradoxes. Things like Zeno's arrow, the ship of Theseus, even baffling quantum stuff like wave-particle duality. These contradictions, they've often been seen as sort of inherent flaws in how we understand reality. The big question is, can they all be solved? Our discussion today is inspired by The Abstractionists' Papers by Louise von Palmgarten, which is quite a profound work, claiming to offer new tools for resolving these kinds of conundrums. You can actually check it out for free at welcometothe.bluespace.com. So the central question before us is this: does the natural reality framework, as presented in the Abstractionists' Papers, provide a universally applicable and definitive solution for all paradoxes? Or does it primarily offer more of a shift in perspective, something that transforms how we see them, rather than eliminating them, maybe leaving some fundamental contradictions sort of at the edges?
I'm going to argue that the natural reality framework does offer a universal and definitive solution, mainly by clarifying this crucial distinction between the underlying causal flow and how we interpret it. And I'll be exploring the nuances of that claim. While I certainly agree the framework is profoundly valuable, I'm going to suggest it might primarily transform our understanding of paradoxes rather than definitively solving all of them. And, it might even highlight the persistent, maybe even active role of what the book calls incoherence within reality itself.
Okay, so the Abstractionist Papers puts forward this really powerful idea that every paradox, doesn't matter if it's quantum mechanics or, human relationships, it stems from the same basic mistake. We've been trying to apply the rules of one domain to another where they just don't belong. The core insight here is making this distinction between the causation domain, which the book calls the blue space, that's where things just happen, independent of our minds, and the interpretive domain, or red space, which is where our minds actively construct meaning. Paradoxes, like Zeno's or wave-particle duality, they basically just dissolve. They disappear when you recognize that something like light propagates continuously in the blue space, but it only appears discrete, like a particle, when we interpret it, when we measure it in the red space.
And the framework goes further, revealing that concepts we take for granted, like space and time, are fundamentally red space constructs. They're interpretive tools, right? Not causal realities themselves. Zeno's paradox: how can you ever reach a destination if you keep having to cross halfway points? That gets resolved because motion is in a series of discrete positions. Motion is a continuous causal flow, as the book puts it. Similarly, the twin paradox, where time seems to pass differently for two travelers, that dissolves because time isn't some universal clock. It actually measures how a process engages with causal rules. The contradiction only pops up because we're trying to measure across interactions where the reference frames in red space just don't align anymore. And this isn't just like a philosophical game. It provides a universal toolkit for actually resolving paradoxes because we understand the underlying mechanism. A paradox, the text explains, shows up when the mind's internal logic reaches its limit. It reveals the edges of understanding. The solution then emerges when new logic becomes available, built from a different view with different assumptions. This is a universal mechanism allowing us to see how new realities emerge through specific patterns of resistance, and that operates consistently across physics, biology, even human cognition.
Right, and I certainly agree that the Abstractionists' Papers offers a profound and really necessary shift in understanding how paradoxes come about, especially by highlighting that they are, as you said, quoting the book, products of internal reasoning, not external reality. And a lot of that is down to what the book calls the biological blindfold, this tendency our minds have to forget they're actively interpreting everything. However, and this is where I hesitate a bit, I question whether terms like solution or dissolution really capture the full impact for all paradoxes. The text itself, interestingly, offers a more nuanced view, stating, "The journey through its pages won't hand you definitive answers. It will challenge you to ask sharper questions." Now, to me, that suggests more of a continuous process, a transformation in how we understand, rather than an absolute final eradication of the paradoxical element itself.
And think about some paradoxes that just seem to stick around. The book notes this. They reach into belief, identity, and memory. We return to them again and again without answers, but also without letting them go. Now, while the framework definitely offers powerful tools for personal resolution because, as it says, each mind resolves paradox in its own red space, that internal clarity doesn't necessarily, translate to a universal objective solution that just eliminates the phenomenon for everyone or removes it from the underlying causal reality. In fact, the concept of incoherence, which the framework itself describes as the very foundation of the natural reality framework and the engine of transformation, kind of suggests that contradictions aren't just problems to be tidied up and solved. Instead, they might be fundamental, maybe even actively utilized aspects of how emergence happens.
So maybe the framework teaches us to skillfully navigate incoherence, to incorporate it into richer models rather than completely eradicating it.
I understand why you might lean towards transformation. But look, when the framework explains that continuous processes resist discrete frameworks, and understanding this relationship dissolves the contradictions, I really think it argues for a genuine dissolution of the problem itself. Take wave-particle duality again, it disappears, right? Not because light somehow gains a new property, but because we finally distinguish between its continuous propagation in the blue space and how we detect it discretely in the red space. The paradox, as a contradiction, ceases to exist because its false premise, that light must be strictly either a wave or a particle simultaneously in the same domain, is simply removed. The framework isn't just changing our perspective slightly, it's literally changing the lens, providing new logic where the old logic hit a dead end. Wouldn't you agree that removing the very premise of a contradiction is effectively solving it?
That's a fair point about removing the premise, absolutely. But disappears could also mean it transforms into something else, a different kind of understanding perhaps, rather than ceasing to exist as a fundamental tension altogether. The text defines incoherence as a deviation from the normal, coherent interactions. And the key thing, I think, is that it's described as neither inherently constructive nor destructive, but rather a constant, maybe even utilized aspect of this process universe the book talks about. If that's the case, then maybe resolving a paradox is more like harmonizing this incoherence, incorporating it into a new, more adaptive model, rather than making it utterly vanish. Think about the book's example of the child spilling juice to solve a problem that existed only in red space. That highlights how often the solution is really about altering our relationship to what we perceive as a contradiction, adjusting our internal model, rather than changing the objective causal flow, which might still present itself in ways that challenge other interpretive frameworks down the line. So the paradox transforms maybe from an irreconcilable conflict into a dynamic that we can navigate. It's still there, in a sense, but understood very differently.
Okay, I see the angle you're taking, but the natural reality framework claims to be a universal framework for understanding how processes evolve and become more complex across observable phenomena. It doesn't just apply narrowly. It demonstrates a universal emergence pattern. You see it in wildly different scenarios, from GameStop market craziness to how consensus forms in climate science. This broad applicability, and it's supported by the mathematics of impedance and harmonization, which is basically how systems adapt to internal and external resistance, how they balance flows and pressures. This offers precise tools for understanding emergence wherever it occurs. The framework isn't just philosophical, it allows for mathematical modeling across physics, biology, psychology, suggesting its solutions are broadly consistent and applicable. That points towards a unified understanding of paradoxes across all domains. Doesn't that universality strongly suggest a capacity to definitively address them, not just, reframe them in a limited way? How can something that applies so broadly merely transform our view rather than actually providing fundamental solutions?
Well, yes, the explanatory power across domains is remarkable. I grant you that. I certainly don't deny the framework's versatility. However, when we talk about universal and definitive solutions for all paradoxes, I think we need a little intellectual humility there. The text itself brings up Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorems, remember? Those theorems famously showed that any formal process capable of expressing arithmetic would eventually contain statements it couldn't resolve from within itself. Now, While the framework's concept of emergence by incompleteness does suggest a way around certain logical loops by adjusting interpretation, Gödel's work points towards, well, inherent, maybe irreducible limits within any given formal system. So couldn't the natural reality framework itself, as a structured intellectual construct, eventually encounter its own kinds of incoherences that can't be perfectly harmonized or fully solved within its own boundaries? And furthermore, this idea of the reachable universe being defined by our electromagnetic detection, doesn't that imply our interpretive capacity, even with this powerful framework, is inherently bounded, potentially leaving some paradoxes that operate beyond our current means of engagement entirely untouched?
But you asked earlier if the solution is merely internal, just a shift in our red space. The Abstractionist papers explicitly offers practical tools for resolving paradoxes. It talks about mathematical tools for measuring aspects of emergence that were previously unmeasurable. This goes way beyond just philosophical reevaluation. The framework actually quantifies the costs of staying versus going, turning emergence into what it calls an econometric threshold problem, meaning we can actually measure the costs and benefits of a system adapting or changing. It gives us clear measurement, estimation, and intervention levers. This is a functional, actionable framework, not just a different way of thinking about things. It enables us to make choices that align with what's being created, to purposely shape new realities, not just sit back and reevaluate the old ones. That active, measurable capacity to induce change demonstrates a true solution, doesn't it? It's a way to actually influence the blue space through our clearer understanding in the red.
I come at it from a slightly different way, I suppose. While the framework clearly provides immensely valuable tools, practical tools for navigating and even influencing reality, the text does keep circling back to personal experience, doesn't it? Each mind resolves paradox in its own red space, which implies the ultimate solution feels, well, highly individual. That example you mentioned, the child whose red space finished the job by spilling the juice, solving an internal problem, even though the spill didn't happen in blue space. That really suggests the solution is often found in our relationship to the perceived paradox. The tools seem designed for us to manage our interpretation of incoherence, and that incoherence, as we've both noted, is itself described as the engine of transformation, not merely an error to be definitively solved in some purely objective external sense. The fundamental philosophical reevaluation, seeing reality as process, not static things, that seems to be the necessary precursor to even applying these tools effectively. Which highlights that the shift in perspective is arguably as much the solution as the tools themselves. It's about learning how to, dance with the inherent complexity, perhaps. Ultimately, though, the Abstractionist papers presents, I think, a really compelling case that paradoxes aren't fundamental defects of reality itself. They're more like symptoms of misapplying our interpretive models to the underlying continuous flow of causation. By shifting our perspective away from what the book calls a map that forgot it's a map, and towards recognizing the orthogonality, the distinct, non-overlapping nature of the causation and interpretive domains, the framework offers a profoundly effective way to understand why paradoxes appear and, crucially, how to navigate them. This leads, I believe, to a genuine dissolution of their perplexing nature, not by ignoring them, but by understanding their true origins in that red-blue space distinction. The framework provides a clear path to transcend old assumptions and engage with reality on its own terms, offering, I would argue, definitive clarity where only confusion once reigned.
And I would contend that while the natural reality framework absolutely profoundly recontextualizes paradoxes, allowing individuals to operate with much greater clarity and make more informed choices, it might just be more accurate to describe its impact as a continuous process. A process of transforming our engagement with contradictions, rather than a definitive, final eradication of all paradoxical elements from reality's deepest layers. That inherent incoherence that the book says drives emergence, well, it might remain a fundamental, active aspect of this process universe, continually challenging and reshaping our understanding. The true value, I believe, lies in that ongoing journey of insight and adaptation, in learning to harmonize with incoherence, rather than assuming we've arrived at a final, static solution that declares the mystery fully and permanently resolved.
Both perspectives certainly illuminate the richness of the Abstractionists' papers and the profound implications of considering multiple ways to engage with the enduring mystery of paradoxes.
We hope this discussion invites you to continue your own exploration, perhaps to challenge your own assumptions and maybe find some new ways of seeing the world.